Okay, this is my first time hosting an interview, and it's funny. I find it's
Oh,
actually surprisingly, I find it to be more nerve-wracking than being on the other end.
yeah,
So
yeah.
for me, this is a work in progress. So we'll see how it goes. I'm recording now, but I'm gonna edit all this later, so this will be cut out. But I
Sure.
guess maybe we'll just jump right into it and see how it goes. Hello and welcome to episode one of the Bandera Lobby podcast. I'm your host, the Bandera Lobby blogger, aka Moss Robinson, aka that weird guy you might follow on Twitter who seems to think that everything that happens in the world is connected somehow to the legacy of the notorious Ukrainian Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera. In all seriousness, if you're tuning in, especially around the time this is recorded, I assume you have some idea about what this is all about. If not, and this has podcast has a broader appeal than I initially anticipated, then maybe we need to do a proper introductory episode to explain just what is the OUN or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and what exactly this has to do with the situation in Ukraine today. But today I thought it would be good to start with the man who some might say ruined my life and made me the strange person I am today by sending me down this rabbit hole years ago. So thank you so much, Russ Bellant.
Well, you never know the legacy of what you write, but your work is probably one of the great legacies, and I appreciate what you're doing today. It's very, very important. Thank you
Thank
for
you so much.
what you're doing.
I mean, I'm of course joking about you ruining my life. I think the
I know.
exact opposite. But your
I
book,
thought so.
your book, Old Nazis, the New Right and Republican Party, which I have right here. I once told you it's almost always within arm's reach, and that is not that much of an exaggeration.
Hmm.
But this book came out 1988, 1989, and it really did change my life. You also wrote The Coors Connection, which is another extremely informative book, which is just so jam-packed with information that it's relatively short, but when I was trying to read it, I had to keep putting it down just to digest all this information.
Yeah.
And so that course connection is no less crucial for me to research something else I've been interested in, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And maybe we have some time to come back to that later or another day, or maybe that needs a whole other
Mhm.
podcast. But so your work has been so important to me. But that is just one reason why I wanted you to be the first guest on this podcast. The other is that we have some exciting news to share, and perhaps you'd like to do the honors of telling our, as of yet, non-existent audience. But first things first, can you introduce yourself to listeners? You're not just a writer, you're an activist.
Mhm.
And then maybe tell them why we'll hopefully be getting to know each other better next month in Berlin.
Yes. Well, I I was born in Detroit and grew up in the Detroit area. Was moved around the country a lot when I was young, but resettled back in the Detroit area for the rest of my life, pretty much. And uh, I was a steel worker. I worked in a steel mill as a heavy equipment mechanic. I was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1968, and I served my time after training in Germany, in Wiesbaden. And uh, during that time, I talked to a lot of people in my unit who had been in Vietnam, and one day I came across a book written by an ex-Army Special Forces veteran that was a devastating exposition of what the United States was really doing in Vietnam, and it influenced me significantly. So when I got out of the Army uh, in 1970, I began organizing and working against the war in Vietnam. By then, the public was against the war, but the Richard Nixon's administration kept escalating the war, invading Kampuchea, bombing and invading Laos, uh, bombing the dikes in Vietnam to flood and murder innocent people. And as I watched the death toll rise, it drove me to want to know more and understand the more of the power of why the war system was running and escalating when the public was against it. And that's what led me into my research in a variety of ways. We had a lot of things going on in the country at that time. We also had an openly racist presidential candidate in 1972, and that led me into some other directions of research. There's always friends who help, friends out there, but I wound up going to many, many meetings of these people over the years, and finally produced a book to report on what I found. And that's the book that you're citing today. That was the first one.
Mm. And well, if you don't want to do the honors, I will. We're gonna next month, October 29th, two Marxist publications, daily newspaper, Junge Welt. I'm sorry, I probably not pronouncing that correctly. And then also Melody and Rhythm, which is a culture and art magazine, are going to be co-sponsoring a conference in Berlin, as I said, October 29th, called the Bandera Complex, or about the Bandera network that you and I are both been so interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain how, well, like you said, so you said you went to meetings of these groups. Can you say what are these groups and how did you, well, actually, sorry, you were a NATO soldier, right? You were stationed in Germany with NATO.
Right.
And
yeah.
so how do you go from there to investigating
all this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, you started to answer that a bit, but
yeah. Well, I started with a concern about the domestic fascist networks, and I had an instructor when I was in a community college who was very helpful in directing me to literature and reading about the backgrounds of some of these groups. But there were important groups that had never really been written about. And when and I when I was paying attention to what was going on in Washington, D.C. and other places around the expansion of the war and the expansion of the intelligence agencies, and the beginning of the exposure that Nazi war criminals were brought into the United States after World War II.
how did you come to realize that? What was?
In the 1970s, if I'm remembering my dates right, it was the 1970s, the U.S. Congress was holding hearings on this. And Elizabeth Holtzman was the leading congressional person on these investigations. And a unit was created in the Justice Department, the Office of Special Investigations, to investigate the resettlement of Nazis in the United States. And by then, some books were being published about it, but they were case studies of one group or even a handful of individuals. So as I was looking at the war system, as I came to understand it, the American Security Council really appeared to be a big factor in it.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted that we could have this get-together today. I think all of you know how important I think the work of the American Security Council has been to the goals of this administration, and how valuable your work has been to me personally, both before I was in this job and since. But quietly and effectively, your coalition for peace through strength has made a great contribution toward restoring the credibility of America's defenses and assuring that all-important margin of safety.
But as I said in the media, was hardly ever noticed. It was never reported on. And they put together this coalition called Coalition for Peace Through Strength, which sounded pretty imperial. You know, you impose your power and everything goes quiet because you dictate the conditions of existence.
America is fulfilling our destiny as peacemaker, but it is peace through strength. We are stronger now than ever before. Our weapons are at an advanced level like we've never had before, like, frankly, we've never even thought of having before.
And I looked at the coalition and I started looking at these ethnic groups, various ethnic Republican clubs. And one of them, I don't remember which one. One of them was I had seen some stories, some columns about this individual that had been written by a syndicated columnist, Jack Anderson, back in the day. And I thought, there's kind of a Nazi connection here. And I started digging in deeper, and that's what led me to the whole Republican Heritage Groups Council and the whole umbrella. And while I was looking at that, I was becoming aware of the World Anti-Communist League holding these annual meetings, and the racialist elements in and later I would discover the whole network included all of Latin America's death squad leaders. In other words, maniacal murderers, and the war faction, the apartheid regime in South Africa was tied in, the dictatorships in Taiwan and South Korea, which they were at that time, complete military dictatorships, and then American and other white supremacist elements. The Canadian delegation were neo-Nazis. And I said, I need to know more about who these people are, because they seem to be powerfully connected to the American government as well as these foreign governments. That's how I got started. And I wound up attending the meetings of all these groups, the Republican ethnic outreach groups, the American Security Council, the World Anti-Communist League. I interviewed their leaders a number of times, and put the story together. And
how quickly
it took years to do it. I spent about 4 years just researching it all.
How quickly did it go from your initial interest in this to realizing that this was a worldwide?
Oh, well.
And what was you're saying your entry point was the American Security Council? Or because I was under the impression that it was the Romanian Iron Guard was what really sent you deep into this.
Yeah, the Romanian Iron Guard in terms of the emigre Nazi resettlement, because the leader in the United States lived about an hour away from me, and then I saw a column about Laszlo Pastor that was published again by Jack Anderson, and that was the Hungarian connection, but it didn't get into the network, but when Valerian Trifa was investigated by the Justice Department and Congress was looking at his resettlement here, it became clear that he was involved in mass crimes.
And he was the Iron Guard leader that lived an hour away from you? Okay.
That's right. And then, so when this went to court, I looked at the court records and court documents, and there were FBI reports about the Iron Guard in the United States there, and they talked about his Chief Lieutenant Florian Galdau, and he headed the Republican clubs, the Hungarian, the Romanian American Republican clubs for the United States, his New York base. So, these pieces kept coming together, and the more meetings I went to, and then when I went to the Republican ones, and I talked to Latvians and Lithuanians and so forth, they just started talking openly about the connection between the Republican Club, the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, the ABN, and the World Anti-Communist League. It was all umbrella of the same people. And so I said, this story is going to take a while to tell, because I wanted to cover everything and make sure because they were used to operating without anybody questioning who they were. They were taken at face value. Mm-hmm. I hate the Soviet Union. Well, you hate the Soviet Union, so we don't ask any other questions, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At what point then did the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, come on your radar?
In the earlier 1980s, and because I read some of the books about books that had chapters about what happened in Ukraine, and when I was at the World Anti-Communist League meetings in 1984, I met or 1985 in Texas, 1984 in California. I met the Ukrainian Nazis that were talked about, and the Slava Stetsko was the leader of the delegation of Ukrainian delegation to the World Anti-Communist League. And of course, she was the wife of Yaroslav Stetsko, who, marched into Ukraine with the German army in June 30th of 41. And his forces helped commit the mass murder in Lviv in Ukraine in alliance with the German forces. And, so, he became the foremost mass murderer of Ukraine in 1941 under Bandera's leadership.
And Stetsko died, or Yaroslav Stetsko died in 1986. So did you meet him, or you just met Slava Stetsko?
I had a brief exchange of words with Slava Stetsko, but her lieutenants sat down with me and we talked a great deal, and then we had meetings afterwards.
Can you say who that was? Was it Fedorak, Belinsky?
I met with Fedorak, and we talked and he turned out he was a neighbor of mine. He lived just outside of Detroit, and he ran the cultural center, Ukrainian Cultural Center. Mm-hmm. So I went to some meetings there as well, and he was one of the top leaders of world leaders of the OUN.
You, in your book, you identify him as, I'm sorry?
He wouldn't agree to an interview unless I could show him something that I've written on Ukraine. And I said, I've never written anything on Ukraine. And so he was hesitant because he didn't want to reveal anything to anybody that he didn't know.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you identify him as the top external affairs officer in the United States for OUNB, is how I think you put it.
Yeah.
Also, when Stetsko dies, at some point they decided that this government the short-lived pro-Nazi government they set up in Western Ukraine in 1941 is going to be a government in exile. And so Stetsko, when he dies, this guy Bogdan Fedorak succeeds him as the honorary chairman of their government in exile from 1941. Mm-hmm. And I think he kept that position until he passed away, I think in 2021. And he's one of the people that ended up resigning from the Bush campaign, 1988, because of the report you did for Political Research Associates that became the book, Old Nazis, New Right.
Yeah, he he did, and there was a another person, Foodie, who was from New York, who was OUN as well, that played a role in the campaign. And
I think he had a position in the White House or the Reagan administration.
he had an appointed position.
I think he was appointed to the court of some court. Yeah, he was
legal proceeding. Yeah, and so he's gone. Florian Galdau, the Iron Gardist we just discussed, he was purged. The Philadelphia Inquirer was doing stories, which is a major newspaper in Philadelphia. It was the major paper, and it was a paper known across the United States. And they were doing investigations of this. And when they would call the Bush campaign and say, "Hey, we heard about have this information about Florian Galdau," they'd say, "Oh, he's not part of the campaign anymore." Well, Florian Galdau didn't know that he wasn't part of the campaign anymore. So they got the habit of just saying, whoever you call about, they're not part of the campaign. And that would, of course, make them angry too. But that's how it went. But after the election of 1988 was over, the New York Times published an opinion piece I wrote on this subject about the Nazi wing of the Republican Party, and not one newspaper picked the story up, and there was no reporting on it ever. And 60 Minutes, which was a major television investigative reporting program, started working on it, but White House pressure was put on them to kill the story, and they did.
I think we'd be living in a very different world if the media did pick up these stories in the 80s. I mean, It seems that the situation today with the far right and neo-Nazis in Ukraine would, that we could have nipped it in the bud.
I mean, there wouldn't have been this, if this could have been followed up in the media and by Congress, there wouldn't have been this Orange Revolution with these Nazis forces that came to power under U.S. Agents, through U.S. agencies, and they reestablished their old SS formations and started paying pensions to the SS volunteers and the various military forces that were organized under the Third Reich, in alliance with the Third Reich, and they began paying pensions to those people. And
now I think you mean the Maidan instead of Orange Revolution, but actually, oh no, okay, well, but speaking of Orange Revolution, of course, that brings to power Viktor Yushchenko, and he was married to a Ukrainian American woman, OUNB member, at least formerly, from Chicago. Did you meet her at any WACO conferences? At the time, she was Catherine Chumachenko. I think she was on stage with Fedoruk and George Bush at the campaign stop that Bush makes 1988, when I think you write that Fedoruk introduces him and he makes a rant against OSI, the Nazi hunting Office of Special Investigations, and that Bush nods and claps. Did you ever meet her?
I did not. If I did, it was so in passing. Nothing. It would have been nothing memorable or substantive.
Well, either way, to me, that's one of the most direct connections between.
Oh yes.
Just an example that this history did not.
And there were other American-based OUN operatives that moved to Ukraine to continue operations in Ukraine.
One of them being Roman Zavarich. I don't know if you met him, but he co-founded the, and I know you know this, but for our listeners, the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, far-right political party with Slava Stetsko in the 90s, and then their paramilitary wing is what later splits off and spearheads the creation of Right Sector, which of course now it's Right Sector is almost old news. Now you've got Azov and a plethora of extreme right-wing organizations. But can you something else in your book, you write that you you get a quote. Sorry, let me just pull it up.
Let me throw in something while you're thinking about that. When I was in the WACL conferences, the guy who was heading this was a retired, sort of retired General John Singlov. And when I was in Germany, Singlov was the assistant division commander. And so when I sat down to interview him, I asked him about, how about the work being coordinated with the Reagan administration. And he Singlov, he's the one that ran Special Operations SOG, Special Operations Group in Indochina, based in Saigon and Vietnam. And they were the ones conducting these mass murder operations. They would go invade villages and wipe out villages that were the basis, that supported the Viet Cong and liberation forces.
Computerized genocide, that was no exaggeration. As the Hearts and Minds program failed, the euphemisms became increasingly deadly. Pacification, neutralization, became elimination. Supervised by U.S. military intelligence, a network of agents, informers, and interrogation centers were established on a scale so vast it was computerized. Names, faces recorded so they could be erased.
I mean, they were serious killers. And so when I interviewed him, he talked about his life's commitment to low intensity warfare. And I said, well, how does this get connected to, what's going on now concerning Nicaragua and so forth? He said, everything in this conference is being coordinated with the National Security Council. And he says, I'm staying in touch as this conference goes on. I talked to so-and-so. I said, I'd like to talk to them as well. Who? And he told me who it was. Because this guy is so used to being CIA, covert operations guy, paramilitary operations with the CIA. He didn't think there was anything questionable about that relationship. But it was he acknowledged that it was openly being done through the National Security Council under, again, this is in the 84 and 85 period.
So that was just before Iran-Contra spills out, and he implicates WACL, or World Anti-Communist League, and all of that. Can you talk about I mean, you mentioned it, but can you elaborate on your experience going to these conferences? And I mean, I'm almost surprised that they even let you in the door.
Well,
at least the second time.
See, well, the first time, between the first and second time, I hadn't written anything, about them because I was in my research phase, and they were letting in other journalists. There's a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, 60 Minutes sent a team, Mike Wallace, who was the best known television journalist for 60 Minutes. His group was brought in and so forth. And I gave them a little background on it. But when one of the groups I went to, they stood up and smiled and said that we were the first anti-communists of, I think it was Romania, and it turned out that they called themselves the Legion of Archangel Michael, but their actual that was another name for the Romanian Iron Guard. they were formed as the Legion Archangel Michael, and they don't use the Iron Guard identification publicly. They use the Legionary, but I knew it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It was the same thing. But they were there, and quite elderly at that time. But you're thinking that they don't even want people who are serious, seriously doing covert operations. They're embracing these Nazis there. And even Federac told me, because the conferences were focusing on building covert warfare in Southern Africa to support the apartheid regime, to building up the forces to invade Nicaragua with the Contras, and a few other covert operation areas in Southeast Asia. And when I talked to Federac, he says, I don't care about any of that. He says, all I want to know is where you stand on Ukraine. So, there was still an opportunism out of all of it, in terms of the point of view. And the death squad leaders, I was in one of their meetings, and they asked us to step out, and I made the mistake of leaving my tape recorder there because I was carrying a bunch of stuff. I left my tape recorder there, and they stole it. They stole it from me, but I got an inside source as a result of that.
Okay, so it worked out.
Yeah.
And that was also around the time that Singlab in the Wackel mythology is the one who cleans up the organization of Nazis.
Well, that's how 60 Minutes carried it, because they asked Singlab when they interviewed him, are there Nazis in Wackel? He said, well, there were, but we got rid of them.
But who did he get rid of?
He didn't get rid of any of them. He got rid of some people that were causing a fuss from the Latin American affiliate. They were criticizing. The Soldier of Fortune magazine was the mercenary magazine that was used for recruiting mercenaries to go into covert warfare in Angola and against the MPLA and other places around the world. It was clearly a CIA operation, but it was a well-known magazine and sold all over the United States. And the publisher of that was, a straight CIA guy. And the Latin Death Squad people, they had some beef with the CIA over something or other, and I don't know what it was. They weren't breaking with them because they were in Wackel, so they didn't have cleavage, but they had some issue or debate, and they were saying something critical in Spanish about it. And the Soldier of Fortune guy got really angry with them, and they started going back and forth about whatever issue was bothering them. So they had their cleavages just as all political forces and movements do around the world. But in the end, the superpower controlled it. And they still worked hand in glove. Yeah.
So to you, you think it's very clear that Wackel was a CIA or U.S. government supported project?
Always was. Yeah. I mean, you had the guy who became the director of covert operations attending these meetings, covert operations for the CIA, Ray Klein. He attended meetings of this group. You don't get the governments of South Africa, the governments of South Korea, of Taiwan, and in these meetings in the United States, unless there's a quasi-official, even if it's undercover, official U.S. government function. It doesn't.
Did you ever hear anything speaking to the? And this actually gets back to the quote I was going to bring up. That they indicated, the Ukrainian nationalists, Banderites, so they say anything to you about indicating about their level of support from Washington? Although I can almost answer this
No,
myself with that quote
no,
because
no.
no.
Well, I'll tell you this. No, one of the persons I talked to elaborated on their covert operations work based out of Germany. Where of course they were based in Munich, and they talked about radio program messaging and studying responses based on things that they could detect in Ukraine as a result of things that they would broadcast. And this is part of psychological warfare assessment and strategy. They were sending couriers into, and this is when it was still a Soviet state, of course. They were sending couriers in with various assignments, which of course were not elaborated on, and so they were tied into, Radio Free Europe. Everybody knows was CIA. And that it was an instrument of the Cold War, sponsored by the U.S. government, and they used it to house, their collaboration forces from various branches of the ABN.
And we haven't mentioned that group yet, so I just want to clarify for people
Yeah,
listening. That's the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which was
right.
the like Eastern European component of
Yeah,
WACL, but also led by the Bandera, by Stetskos, both of the Stetskos.
that's right. Yeah, and it included the Romanian Iron Guard, the Hungarian Arrow Cross, the Latvian Legion, the Bulgarian Legion, the Croatian Ustashi, and some others. All the Baltic Nazi collaborationist elements.
What was your experience with the ABN, speaking of which?
Well, I never went to an ABN specific meeting, but I talked when I was at the Republican Heritage Groups Council. I talked to one of the ABN leaders who was very open about being a Nazi, and
Is that Nazarenko?
yes, Nicholas Nazarenko, and he was a Cossack.
Hmm.
And headed a Cossack group out of the state of New York, and he bragged about his ties to the American Nazi force elements, in that he was supporting them, and he and I talked for 7 hours in one night. And
Wow.
yeah, he just he showed me his pension that he gets from the West German government for his services in the Third Reich in World War II.
Was he just eager just to tell anyone about this, or did you have to win his confidence somehow? Or
No, he's just very open about it. He had no reservations whatsoever.
Hmm.
He didn't ask me what my views were. He just laid it all out. And so when he talked about certain groups he was part of, or publications he was supported, he probably assumed I didn't really know who they were. So there's an element of that, but I think even if he thought I knew, he would say the same thing. He didn't hold back on anything.
See, it's like when it comes to Ukrainian nationalists specifically, there's such a powerful, and every year it gets more powerful, these narratives about how, oh no, we weren't Nazi collaborators, we fought the Nazis, and we didn't kill Jews, we saved Jews. It's just they turn everything upside down. And multiple generations of Ukrainian nationalists have been raised with these lies, and I'm sure many, if not most of them, genuinely believe it. So the Banderite summer camps in the United States, for example, and Canada, I'm sure at a certain point, they kind of let you in on the truth to some extent, but for the most part, these kids are raised to worship people like Stepan Bandera and Yaroslav Stetsko, not because they were Nazi collaborators, but even to worship them as anti-Nazi freedom fighters, And of course, the main thing is, well, but so it's like I can wrap my head around people having these subscribing to these myths about OUN, but the ABN, where all these groups are all together, surely they can't all be anti-Nazi freedom fighters who all have special circumstances. I mean, I think so. To me, the ABN is where it's really incriminating because you have people like Nazarenko who are just so open about it, and
Right.
the present day leadership of the Bandera organization, OUNB, and I don't know if we clarified that already. There's the OUN, and then it splits into the Melnikite and Banderite, and so we're mainly focused on the OUNB, which led the ABN, which was part of the World Anti-Communist League, and the OUNB leader, Stetsko, who you mentioned, were in the leadership of World Anti-Communist League. There's no reasonable doubt about or plausible deniability when it comes to the ABN. And so the present day leaders of the OUNB network today grew up in the ABN. And so, even if the Ukrainian nationalists have got it to a T, the script, the fact they're willing to be with people like Nazarenko, I think gives the game away that this is all, they know they're lying and this is all a fraud.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's, I mean, the fact that they were able to get away with it then explains, how can you be surprised that Azov can get away with having the Wolfsangel when ABN even has the ABN symbol even has sort of a Wolfsangel in there. So I mean, maybe that's not where it comes from, but I mean, it's just no, it's just incredible. I mean, it never ceases to amaze you.
The guy who organized the ethnic arm of the Republican Party, pulling all the elements of ABN to become the ethnic arm of the Republican Party. He was the Arrow Cross government of Hungary in the
Pastor.
war. Yeah, Laszlo Pastor. He was the liaison in Berlin to, he was the direct connection between the Arrow Cross Nazi government of Hungary that replaced the Horthy regime and the leadership of the Third Reich. He was a liaison. So you can't say he was fighting Nazis. He wasn't. He was eagerly assisting them. The Arrow Cross took power in Hungary when the Horthy regime realized that the war was lost on the Axis side. He had been sending soldiers in to fight with the Germans and so forth, but he said, "No, we're pulling back, we're pulling out." And so with the help of the SS, the Arrow Cross seized power. The ABN was formed to actually, after the Battle of Stalingrad, to assist Germany. And
right, they have that conference, 1943.
Yeah, in the forests in Ukraine, and so they were part of that. And most of them do not pretend that they were anti-Nazi. In fact, even when Latvia was no longer a Soviet republic and went free, the SS elements reemerged, not ashamed of their identity as having been part of the Latvian Legion.
Well, you mentioning the Arrow Cross and Horthy, that reminds me, there's an interesting dimension which I don't know quite how to explain all this, but it seems so. We mentioned there's the ABN, which is the OUNB and basically a neo-fascist project. But then the CIA creates something called the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which a lot of the groups that they were working with were actually the ones who were saying the ABN are fascists. So when the Arrow Cross people from ABN would come to the United States, the Hungarian National Council, I think it was, leaders of that, which was the CIA-backed group in the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which was like CIA's little model UN United Nations club or something. They're denouncing them as fascists. I think the Romanian group did the same thing with the Iron Guard. And so it seems like, at least initially at the start of the Cold War, that the CIA has enough self-awareness that, these people are not great for your image of fighting, for freedom or whatever. But it seems clear that by the 80s, when Ronald Reagan is in office, that when World Anti-Communist League is in its golden years, you could say, that, yeah, well, I mean, as you know, Yaroslav Stetsko goes and visits the White House in 1983 and shakes hands with Ronald Reagan. And yeah, so to end for example, with the Banderites in the 1950s, Yaroslav Stetsko makes his first trip to the United States in 1958. But throughout earlier in the 50s, every time he applied for a visa, the State Department and the CIA were saying, we don't want this guy coming in. But then he does come in 1958. They have an ABN conference in New York, or American Friends of the ABN, and the same bureau, the like Eastern European desk or bureau of the State Department, which had been recommending that Stetsko stay out, sends greetings to the conference. So it's almost like a if you can't beat them, join them type of situation, maybe. I mean, I'm not quite sure exactly how to explain the relationship, but it seems that throughout the Cold War, they definitely. Oh, and going back to that quote, I was going to say, you say you're quoting an OUNB member who insisted on anonymity, and they tell you, quote, "You have to understand, we are an underground organization. We have spent years quietly penetrating positions of influence."
Yes.
Can you, and if not, it's fine, but can you tell us who that was that you spoke to? Okay.
I'd rather not, because when I make a promise, I want to keep it.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Yeah, and but to the point that you're raising about the non-Nazi elements that are organized through the CIA, the way I've seen them, the CIA operating as what they do is that they try to bring the political spectrum under their control, not just one element of it. And so, they were funding social democratic parties in Europe in the 50s, the 60s, and I don't know when it stopped. But they were in that was in Germany and France, in Italy, and probably other countries as well. And so, in the right wing, I remember there was a right wing show, firing line. I think it was the Buckleys ran it, and they criticized the CIA for funding what they called the near left, which were the Social Democrat parties that back then had some aspects of left politics that you don't see so much now. And but they arrived and thrived because they were there to contend to take down the communist parties, which had influence in especially in France and Italy. So they engaged the political spectrum, and so if they had their fratricidal little fights, the CIA could say, you go in your room, you can issue these little things, but this isn't, we're operating on a larger scale and with a world strategy, and your historic little differences are not what we're here to discuss. I think that's how we dealt with it. But they let them blow off a little steam, but they still controlled them both. Because in 1967, when WACO's formed, the Stetskos are there.
Oh, I don't know if maybe you saw, I did send you that ABN footage.
Yes, and I responded to it.
Oh, you did? Okay, I didn't see.
Yeah,
but also there's the other thing I made with this guy was the U.S. leader of OUNB now, in this video in 1989, he rants about you and your book,
Oh, yeah.
or old Nazis. And so I don't know how to insert that here, but I'm going to. So I think I'll, yeah.
In effect, what we found is that there's a network of people, men, that is doing this, and there's a reason for it. The reason is, and we very concretely know it because in America we suffered from it, the reason is they're trying to devastate us altogether in terms of our power. You know that 2 Ukrainians got fired from the Bush campaign. Both of them had nothing to do with the Nazis. Belensky was someone who was born and raised in the United States, even though he's a super uke and stuff. Fedorak was 7 years old during World War II, couldn't have possibly been a Nazi, but both got fired as Nazis. Well, guess what? Chris Simpson, Aaron, all these guys belong to the Magic Circle. They're all mentioned in this particular work by Russ Bellant, Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Reagan administration. The role of the domestic fascist networks in the Republican Party and their effect on U.S. Cold War politics. It is this work that was published by the National Jewish Weekly that started the trouble for Fedorak and Belensky and got them fired from the Bush campaign, and we now have no political impact in the Washington.
That's a good endorsement for our audience.
Yeah.
And as you know, Charles Allen, the greatest researcher on war criminals in the United States. I mean, he wrote several books on it.
Who is Charlie Allen, and what kind of damage did he do to us? First, Charlie Allen started his crusade against the Nazis in the United States as early as the 1950s. Folks, this is the most dangerous character we have to deal with because this character helped set up the OSI.
He wrote a book about Huizinga becoming the NATO commander, and Huizinga had been the top general for the Third Reich. He had been closer to Hitler from 38 to 45 than any other general. I mean, he'd served longer with Hitler than anybody else did. And they made him commander of all NATO forces and gave him an office in the Pentagon. And so the embrace of the Third Reich, there was no shame, because the people who were doing these kinds of things, the Dulles brothers who worked, one Dulles brother ran the State Department, another Dulles brother ran the CIA, and they both worked for Eisenhower, who at one point said, he said during the war that one of our war aims has to be to dismantle the German general staff. And here he is, president of the United States, and he's doing just the opposite. His administration is. He's out playing golf a lot. But the Dulles brothers were working with German industry in the 1930s that were funding Hitler. They weren't anti-Nazi. They just resented the fact that Hitler declared war on the United States. So they had to work on the U.S. side, but they were at the same time recruiting while the war was still going on. In the last years, Operation Sunrise, they were still recruiting elements to defect to the United States side and have a long-term alliance with them against the Soviet Union. Even while the war was going on and the Soviet Union lost 30 million people, they were planning the backstab on the alliance, and so they were, there was always a powerful element in the United States, an influential element that supported Hitler, and they called themselves the America First Committee, and some of them were simply Wall Street powerhouses, like the Dulles brothers.
And if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned the American Security Council, which in your book, you quote someone who refers to it as the personification of the military industrial complex. But you trace the history of ASC, American Security Council, to America First Committee, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, Robert Wood was the chair of the America First Committee. And America First Committee was determined to fight the Roosevelt administration to keep the United States out of war in Europe. and of course, United States went into the European theater in World War I, and so they saw the possibility of this war that they knew was brewing in Europe, with Hitler planning to march east. They wanted the United States to stay out of that and to give a free hand to the Axis powers. So the America First Committee worked very hard to achieve those aims. After Germany declared war on the United States on December 12th of 1941, the America First Committee could no longer say we can't go to war against Germany because Germany declared war on us. But they went underground and they told the public that they were dissolved, but they actually continued to meet for years until the last year of the war. And Robert Wood was the chairman of Sears Roebuck, based in Chicago, and had a powerful ally with the Chicago Tribune newspaper of that time. And as chairman of Sears Roebuck, he then helped found the American Security Council. And that in the subsequent years, they started doing military industrial conferences about building that's where Eisenhower got the military industrial complex terminology from. And they did this over a period of years to try and build the armaments industry in America into a powerful world force. And the fact that he had collaborated with Germany meant nothing. And even in one year, they had the Martin Blank at their conferences representing, quote, German industry. And Martin Blank was the guy who represented the Ruhrlad in Germany before World War II that was funding the Nazi Party. He represented the industrial interests that were financing the Nazi Party. And so here he is now developing developing relationships in the American Military Industrial Conferences sponsored by the American Security Council. And the American Security Council Foundation actually was formed because the National Security Council, which the official governmental agency called the National Security Council, which is the umbrella of the intelligence agencies and the military agencies and the State Department, they were tied to these conferences. And with the Eisenhower administration being discontinued at the end of the 1950s, they created this foundation that became the American Security Council Foundation, but it was really an outgrowth of the American National Security Council, the superintelligence agency, if you will. And so the American Security Council continued the military industrial relationships because with a new president coming in, John F. Kennedy, they didn't think the open conferences that they were doing would survive. And of course they didn't. Kennedy did not continue those conferences. John F. Kennedy, that is. And so this American Security Council was really an outgrowth of these people, along with the American First leadership that initially brought it together. And the American First leader, Robert Wood, was the one that recruited the guy who was going to run the whole operation.
And the American Security Council seems to really be the really consistent partner, I guess you could say, or backer on the U.S. side of the World Anti-Communist League, because they have a few different chapters that form and then they fall apart. And I think, well, actually, that kind of brings us to someone who was in the American Security Council was the Lev Dobryansky. Did you ever meet him? He was the longtime president, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, friend of the Banderites.
Yeah, never met him. But if I can give a little other coloration to this complex.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
In in the late 70s, the American affiliate of the World Anti-Communist League was Council on American Affairs, and it was headed by a British anthropologist, or that's what he was called, an anthropologist, who was an avid racialist. And his name was Roger Pearson, and the Washington Post did an expose of him in 1978. And they touched on it, but he was very much, he wrote in one of his books that it was the duty of the superior race to exterminate the inferior race. And he says, and if they don't exterminate the inferior race, they commit racial suicide. So he was an exterminationist Nazi, and he used to hold rallies in Germany, in the forest in Germany, under an umbrella of the Northern League, which obviously was Nordic supremacists from a variety of countries, and so he was well known and trusted in Nazi circles worldwide. He was well known. He was tied to the Spotlight, which was a neo-Nazi newspaper in the United States, headed by the Liberty Lobby, published by the Liberty Lobby. And he relocated into the United States from Britain to begin working more closely with Washington, D.C. And he first went to Montana, to a college in Montana, and then later transferred everywhere and set up his offices in Washington, D.C. Not that far from the White House, as I recall. And I talked with him several times, but again, that was in the late 70s. And then when the Singlaub took over, he replaced him because they figured they couldn't operate out in the open anymore after that Washington Post story. It was Roger Pearson. And so, but that was that he came into the World Anti-Communist League leadership through the American Security Council and their ties to the National Security Council.
I want to actually, you mentioned Charles Allen. What was your relationship with Allen?
Oh, he was a mentor to me, because in the early stages I didn't understand the scope of it, and he had stuff going back to the 1940s on not just Nazi war criminal stuff, but on pro-Nazi and pro-Axis elements in the United States. And he also had access to a publication called In Fact, which was published by George Seldes, probably the foremost anti-fascist journalist in the United States in the 1940s. He had been a New York Times correspondent in Italy, and the fascists actually tried to hunt him down and kill him. He got out of Italy by the skin of his teeth, and he began publishing In Fact to look at all the American domestic elements, the silver shirts, the American First, the German American Bund, the all the formations. I mean, the whole list of American forces, and so he's doing this before World War II, throughout World War II and beyond, and Charles Allen loaned me his collection of those reports. They were like weekly reports. And he loaned them to me, and I copied them all and sent them back to him. So, he gave me a lot of foundational education, and I would check in with them. We only met face to face a few times, but we stayed in touch over the phone because there's nobody that knew this stuff like he did, that was willing to talk about it.
Well, I know you're running out of time, so I want to make sure to ask you. So 1988, 89, you write your book, and there's this scandal with the George H.W. Bush campaign where I want to say 7 or 8 people resign, including Fedoruk, and including Ignatius Belinsky, who's the president of Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, which the Bandera people took over in 1980. And you write how in your book about how that scandal was essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically squashed by the Republican counterattack, saying that this was all a Democratic, like, political hit job or something. So I'm wondering, in the years in like the 90s and 2000s, did you continue to track these groups, or did you at some point, maybe in the case of the Ukrainians with Orange Revolution or Maidan, did you realize that they never went away? I mean, I ask partially because when I say your book sent me down the rabbit hole, it was as a historical research project, and so deep that I didn't, I was kind of naive and just assumed that when Ukraine becomes independent or when the Soviet Union collapses, all those people could say, "We did it, guys," and then go enjoy the rest of their lives and move on, and that that there would be no need for all this conspiracy and stuff. And this is a bit of a tangent, but in the going back to the 1930s, and so the OUN in particular would say, we can't be fascist because fascism is when you have a state. So we're just good old nationalists. But now, after the 90s, the Bandera people start to call themselves state builders. So their next goal is to build a strong, powerful Ukrainian state, which seems to be the project, a nationalist government that they've been doing for the last 30 years. But yeah, I'm curious, especially in the case of the Ukrainians, but maybe the Iron Guard or other people who were involved in WACL, were you continuing to track this stuff, or did you one day realize that it never went away?
Well, I knew it didn't go away, but as you can well imagine, once I published that, there weren't meetings that I could go to anymore. If I had any common sense at the time, people thought I was crazy going to the meetings then. I said, I don't really feel it's as risky as some people thought it was, but it sure would have been afterwards. And so that door was closed, but I did try to, stay in touch on as much as I could with some sources. But at the same time that was going on, there were new forms of fascism being developed in the United States that were more organic American phenomena, tied to the state apparatus, and insidious and gaining substantial power, influence, I should say. And so I started spending more time looking at that, but I never walked away from the emigre fascists. And I was watching the Orange Revolution activity, watching the processions in Ukraine that were going on, and the marches, the rehabilitation of the SS and insurgent army forces that had worked with the Axis, and so forth. And I I tried talking to journalists about it, and when they don't think they can do the story because they don't have the background and knowledge, or they realize they're hitting a wall when it comes to the American intelligence agencies, and we're not going to cross that wall we're not going to go after instrumentalities of the American intelligence agencies too much. Some did. I stayed in touch with some reporters over the years on the subject, but there wasn't any high level of editorial support for reporters working on these stories.
You said the Philadelphia Inquirer, was that the only major, aside from, you said the New York Times published an op-ed you wrote, but did you say the Philadelphia Inquirer was the only major newspaper to pick up these stories?
The Boston Globe picked some up too. But once the election was over, the Boston Globe didn't do anything. The Philadelphia Inquirer was still interested. The reporter there, David Preston, was interested. A great journalist, a great guy.
Was that also Larry Kohler, or was that
Larry Kohler? I don't think he was with the Inquirer.
Oh no, I think maybe that was the Jewish newspaper.
Jewish week paper.
Yeah.
And but they didn't do any more stories in connection with me, at least my research. So
I asked because he recently wrote an article for the Forward about Azov and Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, and interesting because the ADL basically gave him a quote that was, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it was like, this is not our concern at this point. We don't want to undermine U.S. support for Ukraine. Like, that's the priority, and it just shows how far they've come. But also, I mean, it's funny timing because also the Forward, of course, we both know Lev Galinkin has written some articles for them. He recently wrote an article about these two monuments to the Ukrainian SS division.
Yeah.
And one of them I found on Facebook and sent to him, and the other you took the picture for him in Michigan. And I think this weekend I heard the Philadelphia Inquirer is going to run a story about that stuff. So
good.
Yeah, it's funny how this is all coming together, and then we'll be soon in Berlin, and I think we'll include a link in the description of this video, or however this will be on the internet, for people who can buy tickets for that. Also, it'll be live streamed with simultaneous translation, German and English. And I think, this thing has just flown under the radar for so long. It's definitely about time for, this stuff to come out into the open, and that it never went away. And, it's not that this is the OUNB is the explanation for anything. Of course, I was joking in the beginning when I said that I see everything is connected, but yeah, no, I'm just so happy that we'll be able to do this next month in Berlin, and I hope that we can make at least a small dent in the narratives of information warriors.
Yes.
But earlier I want to clarify. I said the difference I feel like between you and some other journalists who shy away from this stuff is that you're an activist, and what I meant is that you don't shy away from this, and that you really care, and that you're passionate about this stuff. And as we close, I thought maybe you could talk about I mean, I don't know if you have any things that you'd like to plug, but maybe you could talk about the local activism you're involved in now.
Oh yeah. Well, we have a lot of challenges, and it's not just some of it is national, where there's a push from the investor classes and from religious right-wing forces to dismantle public education and privatize education, so that they can create a post-democracy United States. And it's commonly called the religious right, but it's also tied to powerful financial interests, and that want in Michigan, the state I live in, they passed a law in 1994 to create private schools called charter schools that get public funding, which violates the Michigan Constitution, but nobody cares. And they average $1,000 profit off of every student that they enroll. And that goes back to the investors before anything gets spent on actually educating. And they do a poor job of educating. But they don't care about that because they feel there's only an elite that really needs a good education. And so we're facing a lot of challenges around the takedown of American education and the dominion theology takeover in various theaters and various operations. And Donald Trump is very closely married to those forces, as one example. And then we have situations where the investor class has gotten laws passed to allow them to take tax money that was meant for schools and libraries and other public services and shift it into investments into their own projects to build housing and build buildings and skyscrapers. We don't need another skyscraper in Detroit, but I just did research on just our city's property taxes, the city of Detroit property taxes in the last 9 years. $442 million was taken from our property taxes with no public notice or education. I was the first person who pulled this data out and proved it, because we're fighting, and all these fights are fighting an agenda of dismantling public sector and democratic forces in this country and transitioning over time into a privatized elite domination of national affairs. So, whether it's imperialism on the world stage or on the local stage, it's coming from the same place. And, I fight them, try to fight at all levels that they manifest themselves at. And so we're gonna be taking actions to tell the public what's going on with these secretly stolen funds, and build a response, build an organized response to try and cut these financial interests, cut them away. But I'm sure people have some kind of story like this going on in the town. A lot of people don't know the law. There's laws that exist that allow this, even though the laws require that it be public. They don't make it public, and so in Michigan, there's lots of these, but there's many states that have laws that allow this. And if people want to just they can check and see if anything called tax captures is happening. That's what they call this when they take the money. It's called a tax capture. But the public doesn't know that tax captures refer to property taxes that pay for their schools and their libraries and parks and so forth. And I think that can be an eye opener if people want to pursue that.
Is there any way that people listening can support what you guys are doing?
Sure. If they want more information on it, or they want to organize in their community, or they just want to know what we're doing or support what we're doing, they can call me. And my phone number is 313.
Okay. I don't know if we should put that out there. I don't know if you might get some angry Bandera people calling.
I put it out everywhere. I don't care who likes it or doesn't like it. And maybe they'll sabotage my phone line. Who knows? Why don't I restart it and give them my email? How's that?
Okay.
Yeah. If people want to get in touch with me on find out more to do research in their locality, or want to support the work we're doing, they can email me at my name, russbellant@gmail.com. And I tell people I keep it a real simple email. So as long as you can spell my name, you can reach me, and I'll be happy to respond.
All right, great.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. Maybe we can do this again and talk about victims of communism, and maybe when we get closer to this event, we'll do something else. All right.
Moss, you're doing a wonderful job. I hope everyone appreciates the great task you've taken on and how well you're doing your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Even if people ignore it, it means the world to me that people like you think so. So
Thank you. Thank you. We'll talk again.
I almost forgot to say thank you so much for listening to this debut episode of the Bandera Lobby podcast. Coming up next, I hope to interview some of the leading historians on the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. If you enjoyed listening to this conversation that I had with Russ Bellant, and that is actually the correct way to pronounce his name, and you want to help us expose the Bandera complex in Berlin next month, please consider making a donation on GoFundMe. The link will be in the description of this video.